Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday we visited a number of topics as indicated by the videos that I posted last night. I was really grateful for the opportunity early yesterday to talk through some issues and to field some questions, and that remains a big priority for today. We had some good discussion in that opening session, and I'd like to make sure we have a real priority on that throughout the day today and indeed tomorrow. Yesterday, in terms of the sort of the material covered, we went through a number of particular things. So one of the things that we did was we extended the model following our discussions. We extended the open population model that we had built. We extended it with some mechanisms to make sure that aging was properly captured, even for individuals who appeared later in the simulation through birth and immigration. And what we saw critically is that we were reminded that an agent's properties or parameters are defined at the point where they're created. And that can be in the initial population, but when they're created by other mechanisms like birth or like immigration, those characteristics need to be specified. And you can pass them to the agent to be created. You could say, hey, this is your birth time. This is your income, for example. This is your socioeconomic status at the time, say, of their birth. We can assign these sort of characteristics. And that was something we undertook in the model. And we ended up later adding an initial infection state, which informed them of the infection state which was accompanying them when they first appeared in the model. So that was an important little implementation issue in any logic. But it reflected the fact that when we have open populations, there's often more mechanism or more care that you have to take, because you're not just following one cohort over time. You're following individuals who come in and leave, and they may have different characteristics than the original cohort. But it turns out that having an open population often makes a huge impact on the dynamics of the system when compared with the closed population. There's many phenomena, including things like endemic status of an infection where immunity does not wane, which are achieved in an open population, even if it's an SIR context where you recover and it's lifelong, say for measles. You can have measles remain endemic in a population as long as it's an open population, not one that's a closed cohort. It'll rip through that cohort and pretty much die down to very low levels. But if it's an open population, because you have this inflow of susceptibles, you can get it remaining burning. It's kind of like putting more and more wood into a fire. You can keep it burning. Even though any one piece of wood burns through, you keep the supply of wood going and it propagates. So open populations are a very important element of dynamic modeling. And we saw that we achieved them somewhat differently for immigration and for births and indeed for deaths with turnover there. But we do so because they're valuable for insight. A further thing we did in that morning session, I showed you how to use this logging feature of any logic. And that logging feature allows us to automatically track, inspired by work coming out of this boot camp and out of our group. It allows us to track the biography, as Jeff likes to call it. I rather like the idea. He proposed it to me in the balmy confines of La Jolla in 2014 as kind of the term for this longitudinal stories associated with a person. Their history of occurrences, that they were born at this time, they were exposed to infection at this time, they were exposed and was transmitted to them at this time, they transitioned to a cavitary TB state at this time, they transmitted to others here, they recovered through natural mechanisms at this time, they later reactivated and they were diagnosed and treated and remained thereafter latent, etc. These biographies that we get from the model at an individual level are in fact very valuable. They're valuable in several different ways, and I'd like to enumerate some of them. Number one, they're valuable for developing confidence that the model is working properly, because often they can spot issues, things that should never happen, that an individual should never get reinfected, but they are. And that can spot issues. It may also allow you to spot patterns in the model. This is another benefit. Spot recurrent patterns in the model. For example, some individuals may be the frequent flyers. I'm told now that's not an approved term for use in medical facilities, and we're supposed to call them friendly faces. But by the way, we just had a lapse, Jason. It's the second of the morning. There's one about 8:30 as well. And we may spot that the infection is disproportionately felt in a small number of individuals who get infected many, many, many times, and then there's many individuals who never get infected, or only very rarely. In other words, there's a disproportionate burden of the population on a small set. And you tell that not with cross-sectional statistics, but with statistics on particular individuals, for example. And more broadly, often when we have recourse to longitudinal data sets at an individual level, we can often compare model trajectories, at least at a qualitative level, and you can perform statistics on them to compare even at a quantitative level between the model and empirical data. And you can see, okay, are these trajectories reflective of the sorts of trajectories we see in external evidence? Whether it's distribution of count of infections, or timing between infections, or timing between care seeking, or what have you. So they can be useful in that regard as well. These trajectories, though, perhaps very powerfully, they can tell stories. They can be powerful for those who are not modelers, but they want to see how the model captures these features of life they're used to seeing. Maybe it's a clinician who wants the model, make sure the model reflects the realities of her patients. Or maybe it's a situation of a policymaker who wants to develop confidence that your model is capturing the salient patterns that they see in their IDU population, as told by policy analysts. But these stories can also be evocative. These stories of intervention and of a person that's experienced adversity, they undergo an intervention, and thereafter it makes a difference for them. People gravitate towards stories across cultures, that stories tell something to them. Jeff commented once to me when I wore a younger man's shoes, and before I had yet set foot down under, he commented one time, he said, so much of modeling is storytelling. So much of effective use of modeling, building a useful model that gets used, is a matter of helping to tell stories, helping policymakers or others tell stories effectively. And I have to say, at the time, I neither fully believed it nor wanted to fully believe it. But now I believe it and think there's some value that can come from approaching things from that perspective. And agent-based models, you have these stories writ large throughout the model. You have hundreds of thousands of stories potentially in a model, a larger model. Stories of this person got these vaccinations, lapsed at this time for later pertussis vaccinations, was infected by a classmate or what have you at this later age, brought it home, infected a sibling. You can actually trace those things through in an agent-based model in a way that can be strongly evocative. It has a certain degree of emotional significance to people. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing if it is evidence grounded and can have substance behind it. So that's something that I think is latent in these models. But I want to highlight something Cheryl has been very helpful for me for understanding. It's a very interesting point of learning for me, and I think for her as well, having related to me this experience. Different stakeholders of significance for your modeling often have very different needs and reactions to things like stories, to things like visualizations. I mentioned earlier Jeff's remark about the power of GIS visualization, or the power of a visual presentation of some of these textured model output. And I found that repeatedly to be very powerful at cutting through people's confusion about things who are distant from modeling, and they're not quite sure what models do, and it gives a concrete sense of some of the things that are in the model. But Cheryl remarked something which I thought was very insightful, and it's a proviso and caveat that is worth bearing in mind, that for other audiences, I think it was, in this case, people who are very used to physical modeling. Is that fair to say? Oh, no, okay.
This would be people who didn't understand modeling at all.
Okay. So that makes it even more intriguing.
Yeah.
They saw the images from a model, and their reactions were not, oh wow, that must be a really sophisticated detail representation of what's going on underneath the covers to give rise to that, and it's capturing these sophisticated features at an individual level in a geographic context. Wow, that's substantive. It was more, why are you showing me cartoons? Why are you showing me an animation? Why are you showing me pretty pictures? That's not scientific. That's not a model. That's not, it's not. It's just pictures. What significance is that? And so what's lost there is, and it's, in retrospect, perhaps you could see how it could get lost. We see these pictures and we know they're coming from an underlying set of logic that is substantial, that is interactive, that captures underlying factors. And what we see as the pictures is just a manifestation. It's just a face of it. It's a face of it that reveals certain components of it in a way that's familiar to us, the geographic context. But they saw it as kind of a cartoon, I guess. And as a cartoon, it struck them, I guess, as with lacking potential substance, right? It was a bunch of pictures. There wasn't that appreciation. There was a lot of stuff underneath there that was logically consistent, and this was just a window on that. So that seems to me a really interesting reaction, particularly if it's coming from people not familiar with modeling. Because I've actually seen that reaction a bit at times from dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore, physically oriented modelers who are sort of, no nonsense. They view themselves as no nonsense type, They work, often they'll work, them by the tools, which we use a lot too, for different purposes, but, they work a lot in very programmerish tools, let's say MATLAB or R or what have you, which we use as well. We're a big R shop, for example. But they work in these things and they eschew any pictures. They eschew any images as kind of, look, we deal with the hard data. We don't deal with nice, pretty pictures. There's some, so a colleague at our vaccine and infectious disease organization related to me, he's a biologist, but he related to me that when he was in grad school, he knew a bunch of computer scientists, and all of them wanted to deal with the heart of the software, the engine, and none of them wanted to deal with what they called the snout. The snout was the interface. And they said, look, I don't deal with snouts, that's boring, that's uninteresting. It's not where the heart of the logic is. That snout stuff, I'll leave that for someone who's less skilled than I am. That's all just pretty pictures and lacks substance. It's kind of just trivial stuff, the snout. And I have to confess, when I was earlier in my career, and I was an undergraduate computer scientist, quite interested in compiler hacking, I wasn't interested in the snout particularly as well. The snout struck me as less tough. It was less, I never understand large parts of male psyche, including my own sometimes, and that was just kind of the notion. Real programmers focus on the core logic. They don't deal with snouts, that fluffy stuff that gets in front of a person. That's for sort of lesser mortals. We deal with the real logic. Male psyche is bizarre. But it's out there, and some computer scientists have this bug, and some modelers have this bug, and they say, don't show me pretty pictures. Those are for kids, Show me the numbers. Now, in terms of answering that, there's many answers, including probably get a life, but it's there's a need sometimes to convey, look, this is no less serious just because we're showing images of it. We're showing images that that actually capture a lot of patterns. When I was a young man, I did think of visualizations of modeling as pretty much eye candy. I thought, well, those are all nice and good, and they're pretty, but they're distractions, and really they don't offer any real value. So why spend my time on them? Well, the answer is actually you notice all sorts of patterns from the visualizations. There's things that I notice immediately in a visualization. It would take me a long time to go through the data to find those patterns. And these days, we spend quite a bit of effort in building tools that will allow us to recognize hidden patterns in data, hidden patterns in model output. Ladies and gentlemen, enter the Oculus. But that's just one of several examples of this general phenomenon of really valuing evocative images that show things. And I think, for those of my colleagues who don't appreciate that, there's sometimes an education there. And often what you have to do, unfortunately, from a technical perspective, is assure them that this is rigorous stuff. And it's no less rigorous because it's been touched by somehow this thing they consider less worthy of, a picture. And you have to deal with their cherished prejudices in those regards. But that is something which does come up sometimes. Okay. Further things we saw yesterday. We went through, and I recognize that this probably bored some people, but we went through different types of transitions. We saw these self transitions, internal, external, rate transitions. I argued when when an agent enters the state, it calculates for rate and timeout transitions. It calculates when they will leave and actually does a little countdown if you show the name associated with the transition and there's enough space to show it. And I showed a bunch of different examples, some of which achieved actual transition, others, because of the interaction between the two types of transitions, did not. Now, I recognize that was not of foremost interest to everyone, but to some people it was something that really benefited them, and I made that trade-off, and for an internet audience, it's probably going to be of considerable interest for some hitting a barrier with AnyLogic. It is something, if you start to do more serious AnyLogic modeling, you want to be clear about how those things work, because you can end up having models that you think does A, but it actually does B. Computers are really, really good at doing exactly what you tell them to do, which is not always what you think you ask them to tell them to do. And therefore, we have to be careful about the meaning of certain phrasing of what we request, because it's sometimes different than what we think. Okay, so those were self transitions. We further saw how we could modify models to keep track of certain types of information. So we kept track of aggregate longitudinal information, things like the number of incident cases per week. On a per week basis, how many people caught the infection during that week. We saw that AnyLogic provides exquisite, very nice support, declarative support, for saying, I want to collect this cross-sectional statistic. Say, a count of people with this characteristic, or the average income at any one time, or the maximum number of times someone's been infected. Not a good example, the maximum age in the population. But if we wanted to keep track of this longitudinal data, like the number of new infections in the past week, we actually have to have some mechanism. And that mechanism spans the person level and the aggregate level. There was a counter, there was an event that resets that counter, and before resetting it, prints it out, and at the individual level, it'd increment that counter, add 1 to it each time someone got infected. And this is indicative of many patterns. They span different units of AnyLogic. They're cross-cutting different areas of AnyLogic. And it's valuable to know about these patterns. We later went back and we kept track of individual level longitudinal information in the form of a count of number of times a given person has been infected. And we captured that in a histogram at the aggregate level. We saw we could populate that histogram. That provided the basis for looking with some mechanisms of a 2D histogram at how we collect data over many, many runs of a model that summarize variability across those runs. With a histogram, ladies and gentlemen, and with a 2D histogram, we saw that the histogram and 2D histogram each depend on the respective type of histogram data object or histogram 2D data object. Oh, somehow I don't know, blue. Okay. Well, probably just here before. So we had a histogram, and the histogram depended on a histogram data object next to it. And same thing for a 2D histogram and 2D histogram data. The 2D histogram that was summarizing many, many, many model runs of Maine, where did that live? Well, let me ask this. The regular histogram we added to the model to show the number of times different people in the population have been infected. Where did that live? Where was that found in the model? It was found in where is this? Maine. It's in Maine. We ran the model. I can do it in front of you. I ran the model. What's showing here? What is this that I'm seeing? What's this thing that I'm seeing? It is Maine. If this is Maine I'm looking at. These are the things in Maine. Yeah? This is all in Maine. Where was the 2D histogram that summarized the results of running the model many, 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 many times? That's in the experiment, ladies and gentlemen. That was in the parameter variation experiment. And we had one version of it that showed it just for variability, for variation across stochastics. We had the same parameter values assumed, a single set of parameter values, and we summarized across stochastics the variability. And I argued that this model had many types of stochastics in it. There's randomness just in who was connected with whom, where people were positioned, but then as it ran, there were stochastics when people recover, how many infections they fire off before they recover, who they spread and to whom they try to spread that infection, and then by extension whether it catches, when they die. There's lots of aspects of stochastics here. So here we see, ladies and gentlemen, variability just due to those stochastics. We're running the model 10,000 times, and we're summarizing the variability across it. Okay? Oh, my gosh. Okay, I closed it. Okay, I'll start it up. Alternatively, we could create a parameter variation experiment. Oh, I said a parameter variation experiment runs the model. This is key. A lot faster, typically, than a regular model because it doesn't deal with the visualization. In the words of his Russian colleagues, it is snoutless. The snout is suppressed, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? And actually, it runs in a different mode. If we were to go look at this, the truth is that, and I'll talk about this afternoon, if you do some AnyLogic, you want to have at least a friend who knows Java. So you could consult at least occasionally with someone who can help you interpret things. The truth is that all the code behind, for example, this model is accessible. If I go into an area where I could type code and I could press Control-J, it will go show me the code for this. There it is. This is the code that's behind this. This is the code of the model. I never modify this. It's generated automatically. But occasionally it's useful to look at, okay? But one of the interesting things of this is that it will actually run the model. It'll run the model using what's called run fast. It actually runs it often much faster, at least typically somewhat faster than a regular model run. So if it runs it 100 times, it's not 100 times the cost of running one in the normal interface. It's actually typically quite a bit faster because it's not showing the visualization. This parameter variation experiment, where we actually modified parameters, this was something different. Here we saw we could conduct sensitivity analysis in several different ways. We could conduct parameter-based sensitivity analysis, as here, by sweeping parameters over ranges on a one-way basis, on a multivariate basis. We could alternatively do so in a more clever way, using what are called orthogonal arrays or Latin hypercubes, which guarantee a certain thorough exploration of the set of possible areas of the space in terms of parameter values. but while still avoiding exploring all possible combinations. We also could draw values of parameters from distributions. And we could run it again and again and again in a Monte Carlo analysis. And as Cheryl noted, with the professional version of AnyLogic, which we're not using here, but if one has it, there's a set of additional experiment types like compare runs, Monte Carlo analysis, and sensitivity analysis, which makes some of these tasks easier. I've shown how to build them from the ground up, but these types of experiments can make this easier to, certain tasks easier to perform. Today we're going to be exploring optimization as an alternative to calibration, but calibration can ease some of those tasks. Finally, there's a custom experiment in AnyLogic to which Wade alluded on Monday, I believe, in saying that we ran a large number of experiments over a cluster of machines. And AnyLogic these days is encouraging use of cloud-based computation. This is not something that we teach yet in these boot camps, although we may in the next boot camp feature cloud-based AnyLogic computation, which basically would demonstrate not running AnyLogic just on your own machine, but you could run on 100 different machines, so-called in the cloud. In other words, you don't have to be concerned about which particular machine is running it. It takes care of getting the runs done wherever that cloud be it downtown Saskatoon or be it in Hong Kong. Okay, and it will take care of it. They maintain the computers. They're not things you have to worry about. It's a utility-based computing model. It will take care of it and give you the results, much as you don't have to worry about exactly where the electricity in your plug is coming from. You just plug into it and you get it, whether it's from a wind farm outside of town, the solar area, or whether it's from a coal-based electrical generating plant down near Estevan. So, ladies and gentlemen, here, with parameter variation and stochastic variability, as with calibration we'll see today, there's a need to run the model many, many times. This particular parameter variation experiment, for example, we said to run it 1,000 times here. 1,000 Monte Carlo draws from this random distribution, and we see the result. It's running it across multiple computational units called cores simultaneously, and in the cloud it will be running on many machines, many particular computers, each of which might have many of these so-called cores. And it runs it in parallel because it's what's called embarrassingly parallel, meaning you can run many versions of it at the same time with different values for parameters or with the same parameters running it many times, and you can just do so at the same time without worry about conflict or dependencies. By contrast, with calibration, as we'll see this afternoon, there's actually where I go next depends on where I've been, and so it's a bit less. It is less embarrassingly parallel, but you could still benefit from that embarrassingly parallel feature. In this case, it's 1,000 draws from these, each of which ran replications 20 in number. So it'll be running 20,000 times and showing the results here, and it's finished. Why do we do this with models? Why do we run it many times? Well, one of the key reasons is there's stochastic variability, and we need results that are robust given that stochastic variability. We don't want to predicate our understanding on a fluke, on a one-off thing that happened to happen because of the luck of the draw. If we say intervention A is greater than intervention B, we don't want to base that on one run of a simulation. And so you run it many times to develop confidence that there's a regularity there. And maybe you could say something like 19 times out of 20, we noticed intervention A is better than intervention B. Now, if you want to publish a paper in this area, it's common for reviewers to seek more than that, more than just running it many times, a sensitivity analysis as you vary parameter values. And depending on the community of reviewers and readers, you may get more sophisticated requests, like performing sensitivity analysis with a Latin hypercube or orthogonal array, or it may be very basic. Or maybe in that field they do a lot of these Monte Carlo ones, and they want to see a Monte Carlo type one with some distributions. Alternatively, perhaps they want to see some that are based on multi-way parameter sweeps. You need to know something about the audience to know, for papers published in this journal and for these audiences, what are the expectations in terms of sophistication of parameter analysis. I even know some who have been very, very particular. Again, they want to have only variation not in the initial state of the model. They want to use the same network for all the runs, but then examine the effects of stochastics within that to separate out that effect of the initial state. There are ways to achieve this, and I'd be glad to show people tomorrow if there were interest. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, these types of, one of the big reasons I spent time on this, because it's very common for reviewers to want to see this. I have been horrified myself, I'll have to share with you, at certain venues I've been in. I've been horrified by some papers I read in simulation modeling that are problematic. I've also been horrified by some papers that I see presented where, for example, they had a model, it was stochastic, they ran it a single time, and then they start interpreting the peaks in certain things as historically significant in some way, where almost certainly those peaks would be strongly, their location, their timing, their size will be strongly affected by stochastics. So they read so much into this single run, not having run it multiple times. And that's really something which would be seen as with good reason, seen as suspect and seen as objectionable. So in terms of good modeling practice, it is incumbent upon you, if you have a stochastic model, to examine the effects of stochastics. And for many, and I would probably say most venues, it would be viewed as incumbent to conduct at least some sensitivity analyses. Some examination of to what degree the variability and to what degree model results are contingent upon the particular assumptions you made for parameters, which may not be terribly privileged. They might be reasonable, but not privileged, and you want to examine the results. Now, I'll mention something that I didn't mention in class yesterday, but I was talking about with Cheryl yesterday, which is with sensitivity analysis, it's easy to get caught up in thinking that sensitivity analysis with respect to parameters, for example, or with respect to model structure is about looking at, or stochastics, is about looking at the outcomes here. So we do this and we see, okay, we get somewhat different outcomes for different values of the stochastics, and we assess that. Or you examine parameter values, and you say, okay, for the parameter variation here, how do our assumptions about parameter variation, how do they change the results? And we could see, well, they still stay fairly bounded in this range of about up to 50 or so after time 50. But often it's not the output specifically that's of greatest interest to our audience or to the strength of our findings. Some of the more thoughtful presentations in this area or contributions to this area, for example, have instead of doing just sensitivity analysis with respect to model output, do sensitivity analysis as to which intervention you're examining. If you're examining, say, 5 different interventions, how does the sensitivity analysis, as you change parameter values over these ranges, how does that affect the ordering of interventions? Because maybe you have intervention A and intervention B, you adjust the parameter assumptions, and for each of them it makes a really big difference. Depending on the value of the parameters, A could be higher, significantly higher, or significantly lower. Same thing with B. But maybe as you change the parameter values in these systematic ways, it keeps the ordering. So maybe it raises both A and B, or it lowers both A and B. But the difference between the two is always remains substantial, despite whatever value you have of parameter. So when you look at the outcomes here, it sometimes obscures the fact that, not always, but when we have an intervention-oriented model, our interest is often in the differential impact on the two interventions. And this is a point that some modelers really emphasize in terms of model confidence, too. They argue, look, our models have uncertainties in them. They have simplifications in them. They have approximations in them. And, from an accuracy perspective, in terms of point prediction, we may be rather off. After all, with stochastics, how can you possibly, if you have a lot of stochastics, how can a model exactly predict how stochastics will turn out? Point prediction is often quite near impossible. If you have a model of the fluctuations of measles over time, trying to point predict exactly when an outbreak will occur 10 years in the future, it's a fool's errand. I mean, you're never going to be able to exactly predict the month at which you're going to see this peak. You might capture the qualitative features of it, the phenomenology as they talk about in physics. You capture the fact that you get these peaks every 5 to 7 years, and the model captures that really well. But the exact timing of when you see something, you'll be like going down to the South Saskatchewan River and saying, I will build a model that will predict the exact peak time of every wave on this river for the next 100 years. I mean, forget about it. It's just out of the question. Essentially, there's so many stochastic factors that trying to get the exact peak in terms of exact match is going to be really problematic. It's going to be really problematic. You're setting yourself up for failure. But if you don't view the model as engaged in point prediction, but you rather view it as something where you're trying to capture the differential effects of interventions, maybe the model has all these issues with it, but maybe in terms of capturing the relative effect of A and B as interventions, it's pretty good. Maybe it captures the fact that A has much more of an impact and sooner than B, or A has more of an impact but it takes longer than B. Maybe the model's pretty reliable in those regards. And similarly, as we vary parameter values, maybe it raises A and B or lowers A and B consistently, but A is always better than B by a significant margin. These are things you should think about. So when you conduct sensitivity analyses, don't assume that it always needs to be conducted with respect to model output. You can think about conducting it, ladies and gentlemen, with respect to the relative desirability or outcome or trade-offs between different policies, and perhaps get results that are much more robust yet than if you were to just focus for each one independently on how much does it affect outcomes. Sure, outcomes may be affected a lot, but it doesn't affect one whit the basic findings with respect to intervention desirability. Think about that. It's an important point, and it's a point that's often missed in the modeling literature, but has been brought out quite nicely by some papers that we've been privileged to be part of. One of which had Yuan, who presented on the ministry model as its lead author. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, those were some comments on sensitivity analysis. An important topic, one that AnyLogic supports well, with a modicum of mechanism in frobbing, like salvaging this information from inside of main, putting it into information within our experiment so that we could summarize it in a 2D histogram here. Okay? Ladies and gentlemen, those were some comments in my retrospective on day 4. Are there any points of discussion you'd like to have with respect to that before we go on to new material? Any broader issues you'd like to come up with as well? Yeah, Megan. Oh, sorry, Megan first, and then yeah. I saw your hand. Yeah.
So I was just curious, from more of a conceptual question. You mentioned that the benefit of ABM is that it incorporates these linking variables. But I was wondering, is that something that you can actually measure, like you can maybe pass analysis or equation modeling, or is that just something? And how much of this randomness is really just changing linking variables versus?
So much of my life these days, in data science and in system science, is spent around latent variables. And it's a topic, these variables that are not themselves observable, but often which give, through interconnections with other variables, are coupled with or tied in with, entangled with variables that are observable. It's an interesting thing, and yes, I did make that remark about ABM, but I actually made that remark about ABM as compared to, say, microsimulation modeling, which traditionally has dealt with observables, it dealt specifically with observables. But I would say it's not just ABM. Like system dynamics as a discipline, as a methodology, tends to represent latent variables as well. By contrast, I would say discrete event modeling has more of a empirically, it tends to hew more towards very concrete things that are observable rather than the underlying drivers. Would you say that's fair to say, Jeff?
Yeah, it's more of the how than the why.
Yeah. So ABM and system dynamics tend to share this perspective of engaging in theory building and theory characterization with the model, rather than kind of prediction on the basis of observables. Now, many of my closest colleagues on the statistical front these days are Bayesian statisticians for whom latent variables are a familiar part of their statistical repertoire. I mean, you have latent variables that are not directly observable but are important elements of the theory that drive other variables. And you quantify over them, you reason about them, and they're considered an important part of the repertoire. But there are, within biostatistics tradition, the traditional focus has been again on observables and observables that are, that are used as explanatory variables, as covariates and regressions or what have you. And now you're starting to see if not collision. Michael Jordan, a professor of mine from MIT years, way back in the late 80s, learned my first connectionist, took my first connectionist course from him. Went on to serve at Berkeley. And he talks about the collision of disciplines. He articulated, gosh, it was 4 years ago now, at a joint statistical society meeting I was at, how computer science and statistics are in a collision course, with not in the sense of a transgressive blow up, but in the sense that they're coming together as a discipline and cross-fertilizing each other and enriching each other. And computer scientists need to think about data as something more than a burden to be, to do work on. And statisticians need to realize that they have to totally change their game to deal with data at scale, with hundreds of millions of records. They're not going to be able to just rely on their traditional statistical repertoire. And to reason about the drivers for these patterns, biostatisticians are going to need to up their game to reason about latent variables. There's kind of a positivist tradition, I think, that was reflected in I don't want to go too far out on a limb here philosophically, but during the mid, okay, I got to avoid laughing about this too much, but during the mid 1900s, mid to late mid to sort of 60s, early 70s, there was this real shtick, right, with behaviorist traditions and so on. It's unscientific to talk about anything but the observable. You can't talk about the animal is experiencing any internal state. It exhibits the baby exhibits startled responses. And there was very much a norm against speaking about any underlying drivers because it was considered unscientific. It's not observable, therefore we can't say it exists. Which I think of as just wildly, wildly weird. But they didn't ask me. But in recent years, there's been more of a, I think, thinking in the health sciences, more of a coming to a certain awareness with the rise of critical realism that there are these posited to be these underlying generative mechanisms, and thinking about why and under what conditions interventions are effective or not simply whether it is or is not. I think at the statistical world, many modelers are now in the statistical world, more embracing latent variables that traditionally were considered outside the sphere of biostatistical repertoire. And I think they're really important. And yes, dynamic models embrace these because they are often of central import to accounting for a theory of what's going on. We often can observe a small fraction of the world. Now, this may sound dispiriting. We can only observe 10% of factors out there. I'm probably underplaying it, but a small fraction. And certainly from a public health perspective, often what we have recourse to from a data perspective traditionally is a very small fraction of what's actually going on. So we observe weights on a biennial basis, for this population, but we don't observe aspects of fat mass. We don't observe aspects of reliable physical activity, etc. I see this as something, though, that has much less negative connotation than people might think. And particularly if you move beyond a linear reductionist perspective on things, where you think of things as a catalog of different items, these are observable, these are not, we have to deal with the consequences. The fact is we're dealing with complex systems here. We're dealing with coupled systems, systems that are entangled. And what dynamical systems theory from the 70s told us, and which was subsequently developed, Doyle Farmer and the Santa Cruz Collective and so on, and it harks back to Flores Takens and the embedding theorem and so on, is that when we have these complex systems, when we have these systems that exhibit nonlinearity and that evolve over time, it turns out that what you observe for one part of the system often tells you a lot about the state of the entire the entire set of drivers that drive it. Now this sounds outre, but it can be mathematically shown that if you have a coupled system and you can observe one variable in that coupled system, and you can observe its rates of change over time and measure it over time, you can actually reconstruct the so-called state space of the underlying system that's giving rise to it. That one variable almost gives you a holographic picture of the system as a whole because of the entanglement. Now, again, this may sound bizarre. I've had fellow computer scientists tell me that's impossible. No, it's not impossible. It's mathematically shown, and we can show it in many case examples that it's perfectly possible. And I could show for particular cases exactly why it is. It's a little bit like this. To give a sense of plausibility, let's open up a model so we can get people, actually enjoying themselves rather than purely listening to droning. So if we go to help and we go to example models in AnyLogic, I'd like to call up the AnyLogic help screen, and I'd like to go to scroll down on this right, and there should be a thing called predator prey agent based. Do you see that? Do you see predator prey agent based? So where did I go? I went to help example models, and then I scrolled down here to something called predator prey agent based. Do you see that? So I engage in frobbing behavior here, and I go to predator prey agent based. Do you see it? Okay. Let's open that up, because I think it will help illustrate this. This is a neat little model. Okay, so basically we have a rather simple accounting for veterinary matters here. So we have hares and we have lynxes. Okay, and there's a rather simple notion, a characterization of lynxes and hares. The notion of what it means to be a lynx in this model is completely is highly simplified. So basically, blank. Okay, about 5 seconds or so. So what it means to be a hare is interesting. They have a certain location. They're going to be in a certain cell in discrete space. So it's going to be like some grid cells. It'll be at a certain place, and they can move around. Okay? And they move around to chase things, to hunt. They'll go hunting, and if they can catch an animal, what is this diamond? Does anyone remember? Yeah, that's a branch. It's a condition. If they're lucky, they eat and they stay alive. Otherwise, they go back and later hunt. And if eventually they don't eat enough, they will go and die. That's why there's a timeout transition here. Okay. You notice, by the way, take a look at this model. This is exploiting the fact that we said yesterday. They'll only take this transition if they don't go out and re-enter this. Because if they re-enter this state, this transition will be reset, counting up. So basically, as long as they eat, they re-enter this kind of more yellow state, the state on which my hand rests. And therefore, this timing will be reset, okay? And then eventually they die of old age. Even old lynxes go to die. Okay. So this is the life, ladies and gentlemen, of a lynx. If we go to look at the life of a hare, it's even simpler. They're alive. Kind of a sad portrait of life. They're eaten by a lynx or they die because of age, and in the meantime they have babies. Okay? But they also have a location. And they most certainly also have natality. So let's run this thing. Okay? Here we go. We can set the initial number of lynxes and hares. Oh, man. Oh. Killed by a ugly restriction. Okay. Oh, man. It's mumble. Okay. Mumble. Okay. So it started to run. And what you start to see is fluctuations in the number of hares, shown in green, and the number of lynxes here. If we ran it onwards, Wade, do you have professional? Could you run it? And then could you show us your HDMI?
Yep.
Thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, what you see is some fluctuations here. And what's going on is that the lynxes and the hares are coupled, okay? There's actually another version of this, which I'll refer you to. If you go back to help to example models, this one you can definitely run. Scroll down. There's a thing called predator-prey. Not predator-prey agent-based, but predator-prey. This is a so-called system dynamics view of this, okay, with stocks and flows. And this is a classic model in population ecology. And if you start to run it, okay. Wade, do you have VGA? No.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. If you could show that, it would prevent me having to disconnect my HDMI and destroy the video recording.
Yeah.
Thanks. So ladies and gentlemen, you see the fluctuations here? So basically you have these coupled systems, and this similar sort of thing occurs in the agent-based. This coupled system. And what this means is the lynx and the hare are coupled. More lynxes impact the hares. Why does it impact the hares to have more lynxes? Sorry? They're eating more lynxes. So it impacts the hares. Do you think having more hares impact the lynxes? Yeah, because they have more food, so they can multiply more. Thanks, Wade. So these two are coupled. And when we have these coupled systems, when we have complex systems, often where the parts are tangled, what goes on in terms of doctor prescription policy affects the number of overdoses that police officers have to deal with for opioids. Conversely, affects, over here the number of families that social services has to deal with addictions issues and put the kids in foster care. It has to do with the number of arrests that are made for dealers, etc. And we're going to show the agent-based version of this here. So Wade, are you projecting? Yes. Okay. So maybe you could run that.
Yeah, I'm getting
The spinning orange ball of death.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll give it a moment.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it is the orange ball of death. So ladies and gentlemen, these two are coupled, and with the agent-based, it's more disaggregated, but it's also something which exhibits these patterns. And this is the deal. This is a coupled system, and like many complex systems, it's coupled. And what's going on here is that the number of hares and the number of lynx here, this is the number of lynx times 100, by the way. There's a lot fewer of them than hares. But let's consider, say, the number of hairs, or consider the number of links. If the number of links is going up rapidly, what does it tell us about the number of hairs? Suppose we couldn't see the hairs. Okay. Let's go back to HDMI here. Boom. Yeah, so, well, if the number of links is going up very rapidly, it's a sign that at least there's got to be a lot of hairs around. Because otherwise, it turns out lynxes reproduce faster when there are hairs. They have more. What's a lynx baby called? I asked Cheryl this years back, and she said, "Don't ask me. I'm in large animal clinical sciences." So a kit or something? A cub? A cub? Okay. So if this is heading up, if lynx are heading up very rapidly, it tells us something. There's probably a lot of hairs around because that allows lynx to multiply more quickly. If lynxes are dropping quickly, it's probably a sign that kittens. Okay. The number of hairs is small compared to the number of lynxes. So looking at the number of links and the change in the number of links over time actually tells you a lot about this other piece of the system. It whispers to you about the behavior elsewhere. And with these coupled systems, the state space can be reconstructed from just one element of the system. It tells you in some sense about the whole. It's kind of a holographic thing. And what this means is that if you're measuring, you only have observables on a few parts of the system. If you recognize that there's latent factors that you don't know about, if all you see is links, but you know there's some hairs out there, you just can't measure them well, you can still learn a lot about that population studying lynx dynamics. And so it is with, this looks exciting. So it is with these coupled systems in general. So in short, being able to talk about latent factors, I believe, is absolutely key for theory building. It's absolutely key for reasoning about theories. And it is, in my view, it's increasingly important for scientific endeavors to be able to reason about these things. Now, fortunately, within the health sphere, we have two things coming together. One thing, we have these richer and richer models that incorporate latent factors. The second thing is we have a growing number of big data components, smartphone-based data, social media, chatter, search data online, etc., that allow us to peek into other areas of the system where we traditionally have lacked data. So we can keep track some of things like contact patterns and physical activity on a more continuous basis and aspects of sedentary behavior and components of diet, etc. So we're getting more measurement points into this system as to what's going on. And both of those bode well for getting a much better picture to not only the observables, but to the drivers for those observables. And ultimately, and this is really probably the single biggest point, or single most important point. Ultimately, if we're to reason reliably to identify, as Jeff says, fixes that stay fixed, if we're to identify effective policies or interventions, particularly counterfactual ones we haven't previously observed, at least in our context, I would argue that it's absolutely necessary to reason about latent factors, about the causal structure of the system, which almost inevitably involves latent factors. Because if we reason about the causal structure, that's where we can ask what-if questions and expect to understand what the situation would be in this counterfactual where data has not been collected. If data has been collected, we can, and we're not altering the data generating process, we're not altering the underlying processes, we can probably rest assured that patterns going forward are going to be pretty similar to before, so we can rely on these associations that we've observed historically being in place. But once we're altering the data generating process, we're reasoning about counterfactuals. Now we're dealing with, we're going off-road. No longer are we going around in a track where if we look out our rear view mirror, it's pretty indicative of what's coming up. Which is what we're doing when we're looking at data historically, is we're looking at things from the past and looking at those patterns. But if we want to put in place new interventions, those are going to change those associations. Those are going to change the patterns. And going forward may be quite different in terms of the associations and patterns of before. The only way we're going to reason about that is with a causal model. And the only causal models that are really fully reliable out there, I would argue, are models that need to feature in prominent ways latent factors. Now, there's some subtleties to that statement. There's some really interesting work of Judea Pearl and others, but there's some constraints for that involving backdoor causation, et cetera, that I don't want to go into now, but that will often motivate reasoning as well about latent factors. It's a fairly rich area, but certainly our ability to reason about these systems goes way up if we're dealing with factors that include openness to latent variables, and often it's impoverished if we're purely dealing in terms of observables. Purely our models take into account observables. If we're open to the idea of latent factors, we can actually understand many things that are not observables on the basis of the observables, recognizing that it's a complex system. I'll leave it at that. I'm glad to provide further discussion about this tomorrow if there's interest. I have lectures related to this. Okay? I don't know if I've done your question justice. Okay. Okay. Other comments or questions? Yeah, Penny. Yeah. Thank you. Ashish, yes.
Were two rather non-scientific elements that assisted me in yesterday's conversations. Number one was a software engineer's delight to see a thing called ignore. That really is going to help me do unit testing and block out portions that should not be.
That's right. So mock out certain things.
Delight.
Yeah. Ignore. Thank you for highlighting that, because I kind of showed it in passing, but it's an important feature. Yeah.
Me being a software engineer, that really jumped at.
Yeah. Good.
So that was one thing. The second thing was when I discussed the possibility of using this simulation modeling in the business domain world, and I took my bosses to some of the AnyLogic Cloud examples. One of the comments that came out was that I didn't know how to answer that remark, and it kind of gelled with me because he said, Ashish, are we going to be building business video games? So, and I'm like, that is not a very off-the-wall remark.
So there's some. I could interpret that remark in several different ways, and I don't know what the intention was behind it. I could imagine it as a dismissive thing that, look, this is for kids. This is just pretty pictures and fun and games, and this isn't serious stuff. I remember back in the late 90s. I think the year was 97 or 98. I actually got peripherally involved from a modeling perspective in some bioinformatics work, at the beginning of the sort of bioinformatics revolution. Some of my collaborators who were trying to advance bioinformatic methods went to a famous biologist at the time and talked with him about, they said, look, the computers in your lab could actually be used for modeling these biological systems that you're experimenting with in your lab. You could help inform your experiments and interpret your experiments using software on the computer. And this guy said, look, computers are used to play video games. How can it offer any value for serious work? I mean, you know, what we do in our lab can't be informed by the same computers used to play a video game. He said, you gotta be joking. And that would, I don't think that your boss meant it in that sense.
Yeah.
I think what he probably actually meant is, should we be developing interactive business simulation software that's as powerful viscerally as video games, and where you can learn to try out different strategies and perhaps develop expertise in undertaking actions, much as a you know, a person might develop expertise in a video game that doesn't offer much real-world benefit. This would offer great training for real-world situations by, just like with a pilot going through a video game that's flight training.
Management flight simulator.
Management flight simulators. John Sturman and Moorcroft back in the early 90s or something. Yeah.
In fact, he used an example. He says, my 3-year-old gets so engrossed in playing Angry Birds. Are we building business Angry Birds?
Yeah. Right. So yes, there's a part of the simulation community that talks about getting policymakers on an ongoing basis interacting with these simulators and refining their intuitions, their gut feels, their understanding of the situation, their appreciation. I personally think there's some potential there. I think the primary barriers to that are twofold. One is building the requisite interfaces and sort of scenario repertoire, et cetera. But the other is culture change with respect to just interacting with these things. And you know, in my own experience also, most policymakers are not very hands-on. I remember working with a policymaker in the early 90s, doing work. We actually had a policymaker who was fantastically interested in simulation modeling. He was a big proponent, using it to make strategic decisions. And this is bizarre, but this was like just after the emergence of the internet. By the way, you could see these fluctuations and see similar patterns where you have, you know, a shrinkage of this, and this grows and then shrinks, and you have these interactions. The fluctuations here depend on the parameters, the relative fluctuations, but what you end up seeing is things that are somewhat indicative in terms of fluctuations like the other, although on the part of the links they're a bit less pronounced, and they're affected by stochastics. Here they're chasing each other around in this environment and catching each other, and then, yeah, well, lynx is catching the hare and consuming it. Okay. Thank you, Wade. That's great. I appreciate you showing that. Many policymakers, in fact, are less than fully computer savvy, and this person in the early 90s, we actually hitched him up to, thanks a ton, to a chat context. We could chat with other people who are interested in simulation for this sort of policy planning. And he was all excited to communicate with these folks. And the first few questions were asked, and so we said, okay, so you can respond. And he looked really awkward. And we said, well, you can all you have to do is type out your response. And it turns out he didn't know how to type, because he always had secretaries type for him. He didn't know how to type. So where's the cue? Oh. Yeah. It was very painful. But I'm actually not using the stochastic versions on him. The point is that you need to deal with the capabilities of the people you're dealing with, and their limitations and their ways of doing things in the short term. The fact is that many policymakers are probably not going to be interactively exploring video games in the short term, or video renditions of these models, in part because they might find it a little bit forbidden. But over time, with the right interfaces, with the right responsive scenarios, the right ways of showing it to them, with generational change on policymakers' parts, maybe when you get millennials into management positions, that'll be interesting. Maybe there will be, a shift to something like that. But it's a deep thought if he's meaning it like that. Yeah. And my own belief is, and this goes along with system dynamics thinking. In the system dynamics field, there's a real interest in changing people's gut feel for how to react to situations. So what are your impulses? And trying to shape your impulses by exposing people to enough direct experiences with a simulation model. And I think a video game type interface could be very instructive for that. And the idea is that maybe ultimately policymakers, just like pilots, will have a good gut feel for what to do in a context of adversity. Maybe it's a new outbreak. And just by having gone through it hundreds of times with different variations, they have a good gut feel for, okay, what do we need to do right away? And they've honed it, not through expensive real-world trial and error, with long delays, etc., but by trialing strategies out one after the other. And maybe that process starts, when they're in MPH programs, or maybe it starts when they are, getting their training in med school with simulation systems, which are used. I think in med school and nursing now, they have simulation systems that are used for the training. Over time, maybe we can work towards sets of public health professionals that have those intuitions because of great interactions with these sort of interfaces. And this is why I'm a key believer in visual interfaces for model transparency, getting feedback, but also for engagement. I want to answer Kenny's question, if that's okay. Christine is looking daggers at me to let you out, to release you. Kenny.
And the condition in the hazard rate of waiting for Christine, and I'm happy to play the question.
Okay, maybe we could take some after the break if you had any more, Ashish also. Okay, thank you folks. Thank you for your patience.